They say this cap was worn by medieval scholars. But what if that's a lie? Tradition has a price. Who paid for the myth of the mortarboard?
We tell our children it's ancient. But is the graduation cap just Victorian cosplay?
From marble to mortarboard display, how did one symbol erase centuries of learning?
Medieval scholars wore hoods. The cap came centuries later. So why the myth?
The mortarboard didn't spread through scholarship. It spread through empire.
Who gets to wear the cap to Teviu? And who was left out of the story?
Invented traditions look convincing, clicking, until you ask who invented them.
Prestige was bought, not inherited. The cap's history isn't what you were told.
Graduation is a ritual. But whose ritual are we really performing?
It's one of the most recognizable symbols of modern education. The flat, square graduation cap, perched a little awkwardly on the head, tassel dangling, waiting for that ceremonial moment when thousands of students flip it from one side to the other. For many people, this cap feels ancient, almost timeless, as if it has been passed down unchanged from the cloisters of medieval Europe. Teachers repeat the story. Parents repeat the story. Universities repeat the story. And so the idea settles into our collective imagination. Graduation caps are medieval traditions, inherited directly from the scholars of the Middle Ages. But how true is that? And why does this belief feel so natural, so unquestioned, that most of us never think to challenge it? This chapter begins with that widespread assumption, the belief that the mortarboard is a relic of medieval scholarship, and unpacks how it became such a powerful cultural narrative. It's a story that circulates in school assemblies, in university brochures, in nostalgic speeches, and even in the way we pose for graduation photos. The cap becomes a symbol of continuity, a bridge between the present and a supposedly ancient academic past. Yet when we start to examine the evidence, the story becomes far more complicated. The medieval origins of the graduation cap are not just uncertain, they are, in many ways, a modern invention. And that raises a deeper question. Why do we cling so tightly to the idea that our educational rituals must be ancient to be meaningful? Part of the answer lies in how traditions work. Many rituals feel more legitimate when they appear old, even if their actual history is surprisingly recent. The graduation cap is no exception. Schools and universities often present themselves as guardians of knowledge stretching back centuries, even when the institutions themselves are relatively young. The cap, with its austere shape and ceremonial use, fits neatly into this narrative. It looks old. It feels old. And so the myth of medieval origins becomes a convenient way to anchor modern education in a romanticized past. But myths don't just appear out of nowhere. They are created, repeated, and reinforced because they serve a purpose. Think back to your own experiences with graduation. Maybe you remember the moment you first put on the cap, adjusting it in the mirror, trying to get it to sit straight. Maybe you remember the speeches that framed the ceremony as part of a long, noble tradition. Or maybe you remember the photos, the ones that show you standing proudly in your gown and cap, as if stepping into a lineage of scholars stretching back to the Middle Ages. These moments are powerful, emotional, and symbolic. They shape how we understand education, achievement, and belonging. And they also shape how we understand history, even when the history being invoked is more myth than fact. The myth of medieval origins is so widespread that it often appears in places where we least expect it. School websites describe the cap as a direct descendant of medieval academic dress. Graduation programs mention its ancient roots. Even popular culture reinforces the idea. Films set in medieval universities sometimes depict scholars wearing something vaguely resembling a mortarboard, even though no such headgear existed at the time. The repetition of this imagery creates a sense of inevitability. Of course, the cap is medieval. Of course, it has always been part of academic life. But repetition is not evidence, and familiarity is not proof. So where does this myth come from? Part of it stems from a broader cultural fascination with the Middle Ages. For centuries, people have looked back at medieval Europe as a source of authenticity, tradition, and intellectual heritage. Universities, especially in the English-speaking world, have often drawn on medieval symbolism to construct their identities. Gothic architecture, Latin mottos, ceremonial robes, all of these elements help create an atmosphere of antiquity, even when the institutions themselves are products of the 19th or 20th centuries. The graduation cap fits neatly into this aesthetic. It looks like something a medieval scholar might have worn, even if the historical record tells a different story. Another part of the myth comes from the way academic dress evolved over time. Medieval scholars did wear distinctive clothing, often influenced by clerical garments. They wore hoods, gowns, and sometimes caps, but not the flat, square mortarboard we know today. Over the centuries, academic dress changed, adapted, and standardized, especially during the Victorian era. But when these changes were made, they were often presented as restorations of ancient customs rather than new inventions. This is a classic example of what historians call an invented tradition, a practice that is relatively recent but presented as ancient to give it greater authority. The graduation cap, as we will see in later chapters, is a perfect case study of this phenomenon. But before we get to the Victorian reinvention of academic dress, we need to understand why the myth of medieval origins matters. After all, some might argue that it doesn't really matter whether the cap is medieval or modern. A tradition is meaningful because people believe in it, not because it is old. And that's true, but only partly. The stories we tell about traditions shape how we understand power, identity, and belonging. When a modern ritual is presented as ancient, it can obscure the historical forces that actually shaped it. It can hide the role of institutions, elites, and cultural politics in creating the traditions we take for granted. And it can erase the experiences of people who were excluded from those traditions for most of history. Consider, for example, how graduation ceremonies have been used to signal who belongs in the world of education. For centuries, universities were restricted to elite men, often from specific social or religious backgrounds. The symbols of academic life, including the cap, were part of that exclusivity. When we imagine these symbols as medieval, we risk naturalizing that exclusion, treating it as an inevitable part of history rather than a product of specific social structures. By questioning the myth of medieval origins, we open up space to examine how academic traditions have been shaped by class, gender, race, and power. We begin to see that the graduation cap is not just a neutral symbol, but part of a larger story about who gets to be recognized as a scholar. The myth also matters because it shapes how we think about education itself. When we imagine our graduation rituals as ancient, we reinforce the idea that education is a timeless, unchanging institution. But education has changed dramatically over the centuries, and so have the people who participate in it. The modern university is a product of industrialization, colonialism, democratization, and globalization. Its rituals reflect these histories, even when they are disguised as medieval traditions. By uncovering the real origins of the graduation cap, we can better understand how education has evolved and how it continues to evolve today. There is also a psychological dimension to the myth. Humans are drawn to stories that connect us to the past. We like to feel part of something bigger than ourselves. Graduation ceremonies tap into this desire by framing individual achievement within a larger historical narrative. The cap becomes a symbol of continuity, linking each graduate to generations of scholars before them. Even if the symbol is not truly medieval, the story gives it emotional weight. But emotional weight is not the same as historical accuracy. And when the story becomes too detached from reality, It can distort our understanding of the past. This chapter sets the stage for the deeper investigation that follows. In the next chapter, we will look closely at what medieval scholars actually wore and what they didn't. We will examine surviving artwork, university statutes, and historical descriptions to separate fact from fantasy. We will see that the medieval world was far more diverse and complex than the simplified images we often encounter. And we will begin to understand how the modern graduation cap emerged not from medieval Europe, but from a much later period of academic standardization. But before we move on, it's worth reflecting on how myths like this one take hold. They thrive in the spaces where history becomes symbolic. They grow when institutions repeat them without question. They persist because they offer simple, comforting stories about continuity and tradition. And they matter because they shape how we see ourselves and our place in the world. The myth of medieval origins is not just a misunderstanding. It is a window into how societies construct meaning through invented traditions. By examining it closely, we can learn not only about the history of academic dress, but also about the broader processes through which myths become accepted as truth. As we continue this journey through the history of the graduation cap, we will return again and again to this central theme, the tension between what we think we know and what the evidence actually shows. The cap may look medieval, but appearances can be deceiving. The real story is richer, stranger, and far more revealing than the myth suggests. And by the end of this investigation, we will be able to answer the central question with clarity. Right or wrong, are graduation caps really medieval traditions? When we imagine medieval scholars, many of us picture a familiar scene: stone cloisters, parchment manuscripts, and figures in long robes topped with something that looks suspiciously like a graduation cap. It's an image shaped by centuries of storytelling, from Renaissance paintings to modern films. But if we step back from these cultural echoes and look at the historical evidence, a very different picture emerges. Medieval scholars did wear distinctive clothing, but it bore little resemblance to the flat, square mortarboard we know today. In fact, the medieval world of academic dress was far more varied, fluid, and regionally specific than the tidy narratives we often hear. And understanding what scholars actually wore is essential to dismantling the assumption that the graduation cap is a direct descendant of medieval headgear. To begin, it's important to remember that medieval universities were deeply intertwined with the church. Most scholars were clerics or at least trained within ecclesiastical structures. Their clothing reflected this connection. The typical medieval scholar wore garments that were essentially clerical: long gowns, hoods, and sometimes caps, but nothing like the square, flat board that defines the modern mortarboard. The gown, or cappa, was a loose, flowing garment that signaled learning and clerical status. It was not unique to universities. It was part of a broader visual language of religious authority. The hood, or capudium, was originally a practical garment for warmth, later becoming a symbol of academic rank. But again, it was rounded, draped, and soft, not angular or geometric. If we look at medieval artwork, we see scholars depicted in long robes with rounded hoods or soft caps. These caps were often simple skull caps, sometimes called berettas in later periods, though the medieval versions were far less structured than the stiff, square berettas worn by clergy in the early modern era. The medieval cap was usually round, sometimes slightly pointed, and made of cloth or felt. It was practical, not ceremonial. It kept the head warm in drafty lecture halls and served as a modest sign of clerical identity. There is no evidence of a square, flat-topped cap in medieval academic settings. The shape simply does not appear in the visual or textual record. University statutes from the period reinforce this picture. Medieval universities were surprisingly strict about dress, especially for students. Statutes from Paris, Bologna, and Oxford required scholars to wear sober, modest clothing that reflected their clerical status. They were forbidden from wearing bright colors, extravagant fabrics, or fashionable hats. The emphasis was on humility and uniformity, not on elaborate ceremonial attire. The idea of a distinctive academic cap, let alone a square one, would have been out of place in this context. The medieval scholar's wardrobe was shaped by religious norms, not by the desire to create a unique academic identity. This raises an important point. Medieval academic dress was not designed to distinguish scholars from clergy because scholars were clergy. The separation between academic and religious identity that we take for granted today simply did not exist. The modern graduation cap, by contrast, is a symbol of academic achievement independent of religious authority. It belongs to a world where universities have become secular institutions with their own traditions and rituals. This fundamental difference makes it unlikely that the mortarboard could have evolved directly from medieval clerical headgear. The contexts are too different, the symbolism too distinct. Another key factor is regional variation. Medieval Europe was not a uniform cultural space. Universities in Italy, France, England, and Spain developed their own customs, influenced by local clothing styles and ecclesiastical traditions. In Bologna, for example, students often wore short capes and hoods that reflected Italian fashion. In Paris, scholars wore heavier, more layered garments suited to the colder climate. In Oxford and Cambridge, academic dress evolved in tandem with English clerical attire. Yet across all these regions, the headgear remained rounded, soft, and practical. There is no trace of the square shape that defines the mortarboard. So where did the idea come from that the graduation cap is medieval? Part of it stems from the later evolution of clerical caps. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the biretta, a stiff, square cap worn by clergy, began to take shape. But even this early biretta was not flat-topped. It had a soft, rounded crown and sometimes small peaks or ridges. The fully square biretta, with its rigid structure and 3 or 4 peaks, did not become common until the Renaissance and early modern period. And even then, it was primarily a clerical garment, not an academic one. Scholars who were also clergy might wear it, but it was not a universal symbol of scholarship. This distinction matters because it shows that the square shape associated with the mortarboard is not medieval but early modern. And even then, it was not tied to universities in the way we imagine today. The modern mortarboard, with its flat, square board and dangling tassel, is a much later invention. It emerged in the 19th century, shaped by Victorian ideas about tradition, ceremony, and academic identity. But we will explore that story in the next chapter. For now, the key point is that medieval scholars did not wear anything resembling the mortarboard. The connection is a retrospective projection, not a historical reality. It's also worth noting that medieval academic dress was not static. It changed over time, influenced by shifts in fashion, religious reforms, and university regulations. The hood, for example, evolved from a practical garment into a symbolic one. By the late Middle Ages, the hood had become a marker of academic rank, with different colors and shapes indicating different degrees. But even as the hood became more ceremonial, it remained a draped, rounded garment. The idea of attaching a flat board to the top of the head simply did not exist. This fluidity challenges the notion that medieval academic dress was a fixed tradition passed down unchanged to the present. In reality, it was a dynamic, evolving set of practices shaped by social, religious, and cultural forces. The modern graduation cap, by contrast, is often presented as a timeless symbol, even though it is a relatively recent invention. This contrast highlights the broader theme of this series, the tension between historical complexity and the simplified stories we tell about tradition. Another misconception is that medieval scholars wore elaborate, ornate clothing during ceremonies. In fact, most medieval academic ceremonies were relatively modest. Degrees were conferred in churches or lecture halls, often with little pomp. The emphasis was on the intellectual and spiritual significance of the achievement, not on visual spectacle. the elaborate regalia we associate with modern graduations. The gowns, hoods, and caps are products of later periods, especially the Renaissance and Victorian eras. Medieval scholars would likely find modern graduation ceremonies surprisingly theatrical. This raises an interesting question. Why do we imagine medieval scholars wearing something like a mortarboard? Part of the answer lies in how later generations depicted the Middle Ages. Renaissance artists, for example, often portrayed medieval figures in clothing that reflected their own era rather than historical accuracy. Early modern scholars, eager to establish continuity with the medieval universities, sometimes adopted or invented symbols that they believed reflected ancient traditions. And modern popular culture, from films to textbooks, often blends different historical periods into a single, generalized medieval aesthetic. The mortarboard, with its distinctive shape, becomes an easy shorthand for scholar, even if it has no medieval basis. This blending of periods is a common feature of historical memory. We compress centuries of change into a single image, smoothing over the complexities and contradictions. The medieval scholar becomes a caricature, dressed in a robe and cap that never actually existed together. And because this image is so familiar, it becomes difficult to challenge. But challenging it is essential if we want to understand the real history of academic dress and the real origins of the graduation cap. As we examine the evidence, a clearer picture emerges. Medieval scholars wore long gowns, rounded hoods, and simple caps. Their clothing reflected their clerical identity and the practical needs of daily life. There was no flat, square cap, no tassel, no mortarboard. The modern graduation cap is not a medieval relic, but a later invention shaped by different cultural forces. Recognizing this helps us see the myth of medieval origins for what it is: a story created to give modern academic rituals a sense of antiquity and legitimacy. This chapter has focused on separating fact from fantasy in medieval academic dress. In the next chapter, we will explore how the mortarboard actually emerged, not in the Middle Ages, but in the 19th century, when universities consciously crafted traditions that looked ancient but were, in fact, new. This shift from medieval reality to Victorian invention is crucial for understanding why the myth persists and what it reveals about the power of tradition in shaping our understanding of the past. If the medieval world did not give us the mortarboard, then where did it come from? To answer that, we have to leave the cloisters of the Middle Ages behind and step into a very different era. The 19th century, a time when universities across Britain and the United States were reinventing themselves. This was the age of industrialization, nationalism, empire, and rapid social change. It was also the age when institutions became obsessed with crafting traditions that looked ancient, even when they were brand new. The mortarboard, far from being a medieval relic, was one of these inventions, a product of Victorian imagination, academic rivalry, and the desire to project authority through symbols that felt timeless. To understand why the 19th century was such fertile ground for invented traditions, we need to consider the anxieties of the period. Universities were expanding, new institutions were being founded, and old ones were redefining their identities. In Britain, Oxford and Cambridge were reforming their curricula and governance structures, trying to balance their medieval heritage with the demands of a modernizing society. In the United States, colleges were multiplying across the country, many of them eager to establish legitimacy in a landscape where higher education was still relatively young. In both contexts, academic dress became a powerful tool for signaling continuity, prestige, and intellectual authority. The Victorian era was particularly fond of rituals that appeared ancient. This was the same period that gave us the modern Christmas tree, the standardized Scottish tartan, and many of the ancient, royal ceremonies that Britain still performs today. Historians often describe these as invented traditions, practices that are recent in origin, but presented as old to create a sense of stability in a rapidly changing world. Universities, with their love of ceremony and symbolism, were especially drawn to this strategy. Academic dress, with its medieval associations, offered a perfect canvas for reinvention. The mortarboard emerged from this context. Its shape did not come from medieval scholars, but from a combination of early modern clerical caps and Victorian aesthetic choices. The square shape likely evolved from the biretta, a cap worn by Catholic clergy that had become more structured and angular by the Renaissance. But the biretta was never flat-topped in the way the mortarboard is. The idea of attaching a rigid, square board to the top of a cap appears to have been a 19th century innovation, possibly inspired by the shape of a mason's mortarboard, the tool used to hold plaster or mortar. This resemblance is often cited as the origin of the name, though the exact connection remains debated. What is clear is that the mortarboard's distinctive shape was not a natural evolution from medieval headgear, but a deliberate design choice. Victorian academics wanted something that looked old, symbolic, and dignified. The square board gave the cap a geometric, architectural quality that felt scholarly and serious. It also made the cap visually striking, especially in large ceremonies. The tassel, which today is such an iconic part of graduation rituals, was originally a decorative element borrowed from clerical and military dress. Over time, it took on symbolic meaning, especially in American universities, where moving the tassel from one side to the other became a ritual of transition. One of the key moments in the mortarboard's history came in 1895, when American universities adopted the Intercollegiate Code of Academic Costume. This code standardized academic dress across the United States, specifying the shapes, colors, and materials of gowns, hoods, and caps. The mortarboard was chosen as the standard cap for all degrees, cementing its place in American academic culture. The code was heavily influenced by British academic dress, but it also reflected American desires for uniformity and national identity. By adopting a single, standardized cap, American universities created a shared visual language that helped unify a diverse and rapidly expanding higher education system. The British story was more complicated. Oxford and Cambridge had long traditions of academic dress, but these traditions were far from uniform. Different colleges had their own customs, and academic dress was often worn daily, not just at ceremonies. The mortarboard became increasingly common in the 19th century, especially among undergraduates, who wore it as part of their everyday attire. But even in Britain, the cap's shape and symbolism were shaped by Victorian sensibilities rather than medieval precedent. The cap became a marker of academic identity, but it was also a symbol of class. Wearing a mortarboard signaled that one belonged to the educated elite, a distinction that mattered deeply in a society structured by hierarchy. This class dimension is crucial for understanding the mortarboard's rise. In both Britain and the United States, higher education in the 19th century was largely restricted to wealthy, white men. Academic dress, including the mortarboard, became a way of visually reinforcing this exclusivity. The cap was not just a symbol of scholarship, it was a symbol of social status. It marked the wearer as someone who had access to education, privilege, and opportunity. When universities presented the mortarboard as an ancient tradition, they were also presenting their own exclusivity as natural and timeless. Nationalism also played a role. In the United States, universities were eager to establish traditions that felt rooted in history, even if the country itself was relatively young. The mortarboard, with its supposed medieval origins, offered a way to connect American education to a longer intellectual lineage. It allowed American institutions to claim continuity with European universities, especially Oxford and Cambridge, which were widely seen as the gold standard of academic prestige. By adopting the mortarboard, American universities were not just copying British customs, they were asserting their place within a global academic tradition. In Britain, the mortarboard became part of a broader Victorian project of reviving and reinventing medieval symbols. The 19th century saw a surge of interest in Gothic architecture, medieval literature, and chivalric ideals. Universities embraced this medieval revival, using it to bolster their authority and cultural significance. The mortarboard, with its austere shape and ceremonial use, fit neatly into this aesthetic. It looked like something a medieval scholar might have worn, even if the historical record said otherwise. And because it looked medieval, it helped reinforce the idea that universities were ancient institutions rooted in centuries of tradition. But the mortarboard was not universally embraced. Some critics in the 19th century saw it as impractical, uncomfortable, or overly theatrical. Others argued that it was too closely associated with clerical dress at a time when universities were becoming more secular. There were debates about whether the cap should be worn daily or only at ceremonies, whether it should be stiff or soft, and whether the tassel should be purely decorative or symbolic. These debates reveal that the mortarboard was not a fixed tradition, but a contested symbol, shaped by competing ideas about what academic dress should represent. Despite these debates, the mortarboard gained momentum. Its adoption by American universities through the Intercollegiate Code gave it a level of standardization that British universities never fully achieved. And as American higher education grew in size and influence, the mortarboard became increasingly associated with graduation ceremonies worldwide. By the early 20th century, the cap had become a global symbol of academic achievement, even in countries with very different educational traditions. Colonialism played a role here as well. European powers exported their educational systems to colonies around the world, bringing academic dress, including the mortarboard, with them. In many places, the cap became a symbol of Western education, often overshadowing or replacing local traditions. This global spread further reinforced the myth of medieval origins. As the mortarboard became more widespread, it became easier to imagine that it had always been part of academic life. The cap's distinctive shape, combined with its ceremonial use, made it seem ancient even when it was not. Universities, eager to present themselves as custodians of tradition, rarely challenged this perception. Instead, they embraced it, using the cap to create a sense of continuity with a past that was more imagined than real. The invention of the mortarboard in the 19th century reveals much about how traditions are created. It shows how symbols can be crafted to look ancient, how institutions use ritual to project authority, and how myths can become accepted as truth through repetition. It also shows how academic dress, far from being a neutral or purely historical practice, is deeply intertwined with issues of class, nationalism, and cultural identity. The mortarboard is not just a cap. It is a product of Victorian values, American standardization, and global power dynamics. As we move forward in this series, we will explore how the mortarboard spread beyond Britain and the United States, how it was adopted and adapted in different cultural contexts, and how it became a global symbol of graduation. But before we do that, it is worth pausing to reflect on what we have learned so far. The mortarboard is not medieval. It is not timeless. It is a 19th century invention shaped by the needs and anxieties of its time. And understanding this helps us see the graduation cap not as a relic of the past, but as a window into the ways societies construct and reinvent tradition. When we picture a graduation ceremony today, the image that comes to mind is almost universal: rows of students in identical gowns, each wearing the familiar square cap with a dangling tassel. It's a scene that plays out in thousands of schools and universities across the world, from Nairobi to New Delhi, from Sao Paulo to Seoul. But this apparent universality is deceptive. The mortarboard is not a global tradition that emerged organically across cultures. It is a symbol exported through colonial education systems, missionary schools, and Western academic models. And as it spread, it often overshadowed or erased local customs, replacing diverse cultural expressions of learning with a single, standardized ritual. This chapter explores how that happened and how students around the world have adapted, resisted, or reinterpreted the mortarboard in ways that reveal the deeper power dynamics behind so-called universal traditions. To understand the global spread of the mortarboard, we need to look at the history of colonial education. European empires did not just conquer territories, they also imposed systems of knowledge, language, and schooling. British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch colonial administrations established schools and universities that mirrored their own institutions back home. These schools were designed to train local elites who could serve the colonial state, often in administrative or clerical roles. Academic dress, including the mortarboard, became part of this imported system. It signaled participation in a Western model of education, and by extension, alignment with colonial authority. In British colonies, for example, mission schools and government colleges adopted academic dress as a way of instilling discipline and hierarchy. The gown and cap were not just ceremonial, they were tools of cultural assimilation. Students were taught that wearing the mortarboard connected them to a long, prestigious academic lineage, even though that lineage was neither local nor ancient. The cap became a symbol of Western modernity, something to aspire to, something that marked the wearer as educated in the eyes of the colonial administration. But this symbolism came at a cost. Local traditions of learning, which often had their own rituals, garments, and symbols, were marginalized or dismissed as backward. In India, for instance, pre-colonial systems of education such as the Gurukul, Madrasa, and Pathshala had their own ways of marking scholarly achievement. These traditions did not involve square caps or standardized gowns. Instead, they emphasized oral transmission, community recognition, and spiritual or philosophical milestones. When British colonial schools introduced the mortarboard, it was presented as the proper way to celebrate academic success. Over time, the cap became associated with upward mobility and access to government jobs. But it also became a symbol of cultural displacement, replacing older forms of recognition with a Western model that claimed universality while ignoring local histories. A similar story unfolded in parts of Africa. Colonial schools in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa adopted academic dress as part of their mission to civilize and modernize local populations. The mortarboard became a visual marker of Western education, often worn by the first generation of Africans to attend formal schools. For many families, seeing a child in a cap and gown was a powerful moment, a sign of breaking barriers, gaining opportunities, and entering a world previously closed to them. But the symbolism was double-edged. The cap also represented the imposition of foreign values and the devaluation of indigenous knowledge systems. Traditional rites of passage, which had long marked transitions into adulthood or community responsibility, were overshadowed by the imported ritual of graduation. In East Asia, the story took a different shape. Countries like Japan, China, and Korea had long histories of formal education, including imperial examinations and scholarly traditions that predated Western universities by centuries. These systems had their own ceremonial garments, often elaborate robes that signified rank and achievement. When Western academic dress arrived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was initially adopted by modernizing elites who saw it as a symbol of progress and international alignment. The mortarboard became part of a broader project of modernization, especially in Japan, where Western clothing and customs were selectively incorporated into national identity. Yet even here, the adoption of the cap was not simply imitation, it was adaptation. Japanese universities blended Western academic dress with local aesthetics, creating hybrid forms that reflected both global influence and national pride. In China, the story was more turbulent. During the Republican era, Western academic dress was embraced by universities seeking to modernize and internationalize. But during the Cultural Revolution, academic symbols, including the mortarboard, were rejected as elitist and bourgeois. Graduation ceremonies were abolished, and academic dress disappeared. When universities reopened and ceremonies resumed in the late 20th century, the mortarboard returned, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer just a symbol of Western influence. It had become a symbol of aspiration, economic opportunity, and participation in a global educational system. Yet the tension between imported tradition and local identity remained. In Latin America, the influence of European academic dress came primarily through Spanish and Portuguese colonial systems. Universities in Mexico, Peru, and Brazil adopted academic gowns and caps modeled on Iberian traditions, which themselves were shaped by medieval and early modern European customs. But the mortarboard did not become widespread in Latin America until the 20th century, when American cultural influence grew. Today, many Latin American universities use the mortarboard for graduation ceremonies, but others maintain older traditions, such as colored sashes, laurel crowns, or ceremonial medals. These variations highlight the region's complex relationship with both European and American educational models. What becomes clear across these examples is that the mortarboard's global spread was not a neutral process. It was shaped by power, the power of empires, the power of modernizing states, the power of global cultural influence. When universities present the mortarboard as a universal symbol of academic achievement, they often overlook the histories of coercion, assimilation, and cultural hierarchy that enabled its spread. The cap's apparent universality is not evidence of its ancient origins, but of the reach of Western educational systems. Yet the story does not end with imposition. Around the world, students have found ways to adapt, resist, or reinterpret the mortarboard in ways that reflect their own identities and cultural contexts. In many African countries, for example, students decorate their caps with patterns inspired by local textiles, proverbs, or political messages. This personalization transforms the cap from a symbol of colonial education into a canvas for self-expression. It becomes a way of asserting identity within a system that once sought to erase it. In the Pacific Islands, some universities incorporate traditional garments into graduation ceremonies alongside the mortarboard. Students may wear tapa cloth, shell necklaces, or woven mats that symbolize family, community, and cultural heritage. These additions challenge the idea that the mortarboard alone defines academic achievement. They show that traditions can coexist, blend, or evolve without one erasing the other. In indigenous communities in North America, graduation ceremonies often include elements such as eagle feathers, beadwork, or traditional regalia. Some students choose to wear these items instead of the mortarboard, while others combine them. These choices are not just aesthetic, they are acts of cultural reclamation. They assert that indigenous knowledge systems and identities have a place in academic spaces that were historically used to suppress them. In parts of Southeast Asia, students incorporate local fabrics into their graduation attire, replacing the standard black gown with garments that reflect regional traditions. In Indonesia, for example, some universities allow students to wear batik patterns as part of their academic dress. This blending of local and global symbols challenges the idea that academic dress must be uniform or Western to be legitimate. Even in Western countries, the mortarboard has become a site of reinterpretation. In the United States, students decorate their caps with messages, artwork, and symbols that reflect their personal journeys. This practice, which began informally, has become a widespread tradition in its own right. It transforms the cap from a symbol of institutional authority into a medium for individual expression. It also reveals the cap's flexibility as a cultural object, something that can be reshaped, reimagined, and repurposed. These adaptations show that the mortarboard is not a static symbol. It is a living tradition, constantly being negotiated and redefined. But they also highlight the underlying question: whose traditions count? When universities insist on the mortarboard as the default or proper form of academic dress, they implicitly privilege Western traditions over local ones. They reinforce the idea that academic legitimacy comes from alignment with European or American models. This is not just a matter of clothing, it is a matter of cultural power. The global story of the mortarboard reveals how traditions can spread through coercion, aspiration, or imitation, and how they can be transformed through resistance, creativity, and cultural pride. It shows that what we call universal is often the result of historical inequalities, and it challenges us to think critically about the symbols we use to mark achievement. Are they inclusive? Do they reflect the diversity of the communities they serve? Or do they perpetuate a narrow vision of what education should look like? As we move toward the final chapter, these questions become central to answering the overarching question of this series. The mortarboard may be global, but its history is not neutral. It is a story of power, adaptation, and myth-making. And understanding that story helps us see why the myth of medieval origins persists and why it matters to challenge it. By the time we reach the end of this journey, the question that opened our investigation, right or wrong, are graduation caps really medieval traditions? Feels both simpler and more complicated than it first appeared. Simpler, because the evidence is overwhelmingly clear. The mortarboard is not a medieval artifact. It is a 19th century invention shaped by Victorian aesthetics, American standardization, and global power dynamics. But more complicated, because the myth of medieval origins is not just a historical mistake. It is a story that reveals how societies construct legitimacy, how institutions use invented traditions to anchor themselves in imagined pasts, and how symbols gain meaning through repetition rather than accuracy. To answer the question fully, we need to understand not only the history of the cap, but also the history of the myth. Let's begin with the straightforward part. Medieval scholars did not wear mortarboards. They wore long gowns, rounded hoods, and simple caps shaped by clerical identity and practical needs. Nothing in the medieval wardrobe resembles the flat, square board that defines the modern graduation cap. The mortarboard emerged centuries later, in the 1800s, when universities in Britain and the United States were reinventing academic dress to project continuity and prestige. The cap's square shape, its rigid structure, and its ceremonial use are all products of this later period. The idea that it is medieval is, historically speaking, incorrect. But myths do not survive because they are correct. They survive because they are useful. And the myth of medieval origins has been extraordinarily useful to universities, governments, and students alike. It gives the graduation cap an aura of antiquity, making the ceremony feel timeless and dignified. It connects modern students to an imagined lineage of scholars stretching back to the Middle Ages, even if that lineage is more symbolic than real. It reinforces the idea that education is part of a long, unbroken tradition, even though the modern university is a product of industrialization, colonialism, and social change. In short, the myth persists because it serves a purpose. One of the most powerful functions of the myth is to create legitimacy. Institutions often rely on symbols that appear ancient to justify their authority. When a university claims that its rituals date back to medieval Europe, it positions itself as a guardian of tradition, a place where knowledge has been preserved for centuries. This narrative is especially appealing in societies that value continuity and heritage. The mortarboard, with its austere shape and ceremonial use, fits neatly into this story. It looks old, even if it is. And because it looks old, it helps make the institution look old too. This desire for legitimacy was particularly strong in the 19th century, when many universities were undergoing rapid change. New institutions needed symbols that conveyed prestige. Older institutions needed symbols that reinforced their historical identity. The mortarboard offered both. It was visually distinctive, easy to standardize, and evocative of a vaguely medieval aesthetic. It became a way for universities to signal their connection to a scholarly past, even if that past was more imagined than historical. The cap's supposed medieval origins were not just a misunderstanding, they were part of a deliberate strategy to construct tradition. Another reason the myth persists is that it simplifies a complex history. The evolution of academic dress is messy, shaped by clerical reforms, regional variations, and institutional politics. The mortarboard's emergence in the 19th century is tied to Victorian medievalism, American standardization, and global colonial influence. These are not easy stories to tell in a graduation program or a school assembly. It is much simpler to say, this cap comes from medieval scholars. The simplicity of the myth makes it appealing, even if it obscures the real history. The myth also persists because it resonates emotionally. Graduation is a moment of transition, a rite of passage that marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Rituals gain power when they feel rooted in something larger than the individual. The idea that the cap is medieval gives the ceremony a sense of depth and continuity. It makes the graduate feel part of a long tradition, even if that tradition is partly invented. The emotional weight of the moment reinforces the myth, making it feel true even when the evidence says otherwise. But perhaps the most revealing reason the myth persists is that it reflects broader patterns in how societies construct tradition. Many of the rituals we think of as ancient are, in fact, modern inventions. The Scottish tartan system, the British royal coronation ceremony, the modern Christmas tree, all of these were standardized or reinvented in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were presented as ancient to give them authority and cultural weight. The mortarboard fits into this pattern. It is an invented tradition that became powerful precisely because it was presented as old. Understanding this helps us see the mortarboard not just as a cap, but as a cultural artifact shaped by power. When Western academic dress spread through colonial education systems, it carried with it the myth of medieval origins. This myth helped justify the imposition of Western models of education, suggesting that they were rooted in a long, prestigious tradition. Local systems of learning, which had their own rituals and symbols, were often marginalized or dismissed. The mortarboard became a symbol of Western modernity, something to aspire to, something that marked the wearer as educated in the eyes of the colonial administration. But it also became a symbol of cultural displacement. Yet the story does not end with displacement. Around the world, students have reinterpreted the mortarboard in ways that challenge its supposed universality. In many African countries, students decorate their caps with patterns inspired by local textiles or proverbs. In indigenous communities in North America, students incorporate beadwork, feathers, or traditional regalia. In the Pacific Islands, graduation ceremonies blend Western academic dress with local garments that symbolize family and community. These adaptations reveal something important. Traditions are not fixed. They are negotiated, contested, and reshaped by the people who participate in them. This brings us back to the central question. Right or wrong, are graduation caps really medieval traditions? The answer, based on the evidence, is clear. They are not. The mortarboard is a modern invention that draws on early modern clerical caps, Victorian medievalism, and American standardization. Its global spread is tied to colonial education systems and the cultural authority of Western universities. The myth of medieval origins is historically wrong. But the deeper question is why the myth matters. It matters because it reveals how institutions use invented traditions to construct legitimacy. It matters because it shows how symbols can obscure the histories of exclusion, assimilation, and cultural hierarchy that shaped modern education. It matters because it reminds us that traditions are not neutral, they are products of power. And it matters because understanding the real history of the graduation cap allows us to see the ceremony not as a relic of the Middle Ages, but as a living ritual that can be reshaped to reflect the diversity of the communities it serves. When students decorate their caps, incorporate local garments, or challenge the uniformity of academic dress, they are not breaking tradition. They are participating in the ongoing process of creating it. They are asserting that their identities, histories, and cultures belong in academic spaces. They are reminding us that traditions gain meaning not from their age, but from the people who carry them forward. In the end, the mortarboard is a symbol, not of medieval scholarship, but of the complex, contested, and often contradictory history of modern education. It is a reminder that the stories institutions tell about themselves are not always accurate, and that questioning those stories can open the door to more inclusive understanding of the past. The cap may not be medieval, but the conversations it inspires about identity, power, and tradition are very much alive.